Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel. I am Ruth Conniff, the editor-in-chief of the Wisconsin Examiner and the author of a new book called Milked: How an American Crisis is Brought Together Midwestern Dairy Farmers and Mexican Workers. The topic of our panel is how immigration is transforming rural Wisconsin. And I'm really excited to welcome these three panelists, each of whom has a whole chapter on their life story in my book, Milked. John Rosenau, a dairy farmer in western Wisconsin. Roberto Tecpile, who is from Astacinga, Veracruz, and has been working with John for many years now. And Christine Newman-Ortiz, the executive director of the immigrant rights group Voces de la Frontera. So welcome, you guys. Really glad that you could make it. I am going to start off by just telling you a little bit about what I discovered in writing my book, Milked, and then I'm going to go to each of our panelists who are the real experts. Contrary to all of the political rhetoric this year about immigration and the threat posed by undocumented immigrants, here in Wisconsin, 80% of the labor on dairy farms in western Wisconsin is now performed by immigrants, almost all of whom are undocumented and most of whom are from Mexico. And I learned this when I started writing my book. My family and I moved to Mexico for a year right after Trump took office. And just as we were leaving, there was a newspaper article that talked about a family of Mexican workers who were packing up and moving back home to Veracruz in Mexico after living here for decades. Their children were born in Wisconsin. They had worked on a dairy farm in Wisconsin for a couple of decades. And in reading that article, I learned how heavily dependent the dairy industry in our state is on immigrant labor. And also this long-term relationship that's been going on for about 20 years between Wisconsin dairy farmers and workers from Mexico who have been coming up to milk cows and help out on the farms. So in Mexico, I went and visited this family, got to know them, and then through them got to know John and Roberto and became aware of this long-term relationship in which dairy farmers go down once a year from our state to visit their workers' families in Mexico. As you probably know, Mexican workers who send money back from the United States to Mexico are contributing the largest share of gross domestic product to their country. They bring in more money to Mexico than petroleum from this oil-producing country. So they're really important. The president of Mexico has called them living heroes. And yet here in our country, we have these weird politics where we are beating up on immigrants and acting as though they were a threat when in fact industries, particularly agriculture, but also hospitality and food service and construction are heavily, heavily dependent on immigrant labor. So in my book, I explore not so much the politics of immigration, but the life stories of these two groups of rural people, dairy farmers in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and Mexican workers who are sort of under pressure from the same global economic forces and have been brought together and have been working together for a couple of decades and have found they have a lot in common, interestingly. People who are from an agrarian background and share values and share interests. And I feel like the life stories of these folks and the discussion of the pressures that have brought them together really shines a light on an issue that's widely misunderstood. I think rural voters in Wisconsin are widely misunderstood and sort of stereotyped by the East Coast and West Coast media. And certainly undocumented immigrants who've been taking a lot of heat, although they're contributing mightily to our economy, are widely misunderstood. So my hope is that through this book, we can kind of reach a better understanding. And everyone on this panel has contributed a lot to trying to improve understanding of this issue. So I want to thank you again for being here. And I wanted to start off, John, by asking you to talk a little bit about how it started. When you were one of the first farmers in your area to hire immigrants from Mexico to work on your farm, and it would be great to hear you just tell a little bit of a story about how that transition happened.
Well, one of the last guys, I think, that was available to work on a farm. This is back in 1998. And he came to me and said that he just couldn't handle the work. It was too stressful, and he just couldn't do it. And so I very reluctantly, because I didn't know anything about it, I didn't speak Spanish at all. I didn't know anybody from Mexico that I could say hello to. And but I had a friend that had some Mexicans working for him. So I went to him, and he told me to look in the back of the Horse Dairyman, which is a dairy magazine in Wisconsin. And there was a ad for Amigos Incorporated. So I contacted Amigos Incorporated, and for the bus ticket, they sent me a guy. His name was Manuel. He sat down and worked milk cows for us 10 hours a day for 54 days straight. He wouldn't take a day off. And I was so impressed. He worked just like I did. I didn't think that was possible anymore. Then when he left, I got 2 people from Amigos Incorporated. And eventually, right now, I think out of 20 employees, 12 of them are from Mexico. And Roberto, I met him 8 years ago. There was a person working for us named Gregorio, who I thought was probably the best person in the whole world. And he was going to go home, and he was going to stay home, and he needed somebody to take his place. So he introduced me to Roberto, and he said, and Roberto speaks English, which was fantastic. And so that's how I met Roberto. And Roberto's been here the last 8 years. The last 3 or 4, he and I have been playing a lot of golf together, and we have a golf tea time at 3:30 this afternoon.
So, Roberto, can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to come to the United States and work on a dairy farm?
Long time ago, I was get some money from somebody else in Mexico. I can put a roof in my house. So I was in Kentucky and can pay the money for the kiwi. And I was looking for a job, and I called my uncle. He was working in Blair. So I called, say, you have something for me? I have no money. So I took the bus from Lexington, Kentucky to Winona. And those guys, that time there was no cell phones, just how they call landline. Mm-hmm. And those guys, they was working at milk cows. And I was in Winona. It's like 3 p.m. And those guys, they was working till 10. So I wait on there. I was in a quick trip. Wait. And the last time I called, I used some phones they hang up in the store. And I called, find the answer. So they picked me up by 10, maybe 12. We get home by 12. And so, I was think something I have to do, and finally I have a job. And that time I was working like 16 hours a day. So like 3 months I paid my bills and everything. So I was happy.
Let's switch to Spanish. Cambio a español porque quiero que cuentes la historia de cuando eras muy joven y estabas pensando qué querías hacer para construir una casa mejor para su familia. I want to switch to Spanish so that Roberto can say a little bit more in depth about his early life and what convinced him that he needed to come to the United States to work.
Cuando era pequeño, me acuerdo que tenía más o menos como unos 8 años, que mis padres, ellos trabajaban duro, pero no tenían suficiente dinero para comprar un techo.
So when he was very little, he was about 8 years old, he was growing up with his parents who worked very, very hard, but they didn't have enough money to put a roof on their house.
Y una vez nos cayó un tornado cayó granizo muy fuerte. Y me acuerdo que mi padre tenía una casa, tenía madera encima, pero le puso plástico. Y cuando vino el granizo, traspasó todo.
So there was a terrible storm when he was a little boy. They were in the house. There was no roof overhead. There were some boards and there was a tarp, plastic tarp. And so the hail came right through the tarp.
Sí, entonces dije, yo pensé que ese no era mi vida.
I thought this was not life for me.
Entonces, cuando yo veía que a los primeros que venían aquí en Estados Unidos y llegaban allá, traían cosas y hacían buenas cosas, entonces pensé hacerlo.
So I saw other people in my town who would go to the United States to work, and they were able to build better houses and have better things in Mexico, and I thought that's what I'm going to do.
Entonces, eso es lo que soñé hacerlo y vine yo cuando era pequeño empecé a trabajar duro. Trabajé en una panadería, trabajé vendiendo cosas en el mercado.
So when I was very young, I started working. I worked in a bakery, worked really hard, long hours, and I worked selling things at a flea market.
Y de ahí me moví. Esa vez yo no sabía mucho expresarme en español.
At the time, I didn't really know how to speak Spanish very well.
Entonces me moví para la Ciudad de México con los muchachos que ellos eran de Toluca, más pegado a la ciudad, y ellos hablaban bien.
So when I went to Mexico City, ¿a qué edad?
Tenía 16, 17 años.
At 16 or 17 years old, I decided to go to Mexico City and work there. And having grown up speaking Nahuatl, the indigenous language in my town, I finally started hearing Spanish with a different accent. And that's when my Spanish got a lot better at 16 or 17 years of age.
Y me regresé al pueblo porque estaba yo como un año más o menos en la ciudad trabajando trabajé un tiempo en la jardinería y me moví para la construcción donde había más trabajo.
So I worked for about a year in Mexico City, and then I came back to my town to work in construction where there were more jobs.
Y llegué allá, un tío mío lo encontré y se puso contento porque él estaba en Los Ángeles, él llegó allá y él se había comprado su carro para acarrear material. Entonces,
a friend was living in Los Angeles and had been able to buy a car.
Y cuando me vio se sorprendió que yo estaba ahí. Entonces me dijo, tenemos una oportunidad para ir a trabajar con visa.
And he told me there was an opportunity for me to go to the United States and work with a visa.
Y gracias a él, pues yo sigo aquí trabajando.
And thanks to him, I'm still here. So, Christine, I want to move to you. And I know your time is a little limited because you're very busy. You're meeting with public officials in Wisconsin and doing a lot of work, of advocacy work on behalf of immigrants. So one thing that I wanted to get to is for you to talk about how you first connected with dairy farmers and the work that you did together in the First Day Without Latinos rally, when you and how you and the dairy farmers sort of came into contact and began working sort of contrary to stereotype, because we hear a lot about rural voters and supporting Donald Trump and anti-immigrant rhetoric, but you've actually had quite a bit of experience working in rural areas on the issue of improving circumstances for immigrants. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you for telling the story, which is such an important story to tell, to humanize and just flesh out the reality of the situation. Because, well, the biggest thing we obviously need is immigration reform. And it continues to have been, used politically as opposed to really just understanding the workers, the families, the communities, the economic need, and the contributions. So I just want to say thank you for that. But yeah, I met John when Voces de la Frontera did a statewide reality tour. It had actually followed a raid in Whitewater, Wisconsin of Star Packaging that was very, very tragic. And won't go into the details of that, but we did a tour where we stopped and we had folks that came with us, and then local folks that were really both people that were in solidarity, allies to the immigrant community, and then immigrant voices themselves, and both as part of the tour and then always creating that local space. So I met John through that effort, and it was actually through a Republican at that time, Senator Kapanke, who was representing western part of the state, and we did a stop there. He's the one who made the connection with John, and who John was part of our panel and so that was really that connection that was made there. And through John, we were able to also find other dairy farmers, such as Tim O'Harrow, who's a Republican, also who've been really staunch. A strong voice for recognizing the importance of immigrants to dairy farms and the future, of dairy farms. We did also connect, later on with Wisconsin Farmers Union. That came a little bit later, which obviously represents the smaller and medium-sized farms. But as an organization, they have just been shoulder to shoulder with us in the trenches. And the funny story about Day Without Latinos and Immigrants, the very, very first one was in, so I think it was 2003. What I think is when I met John at that tour. And then it was, if you all recall, there was a bill that was being proposed called the Sensenbrenner Bill, HR 4437, that would have converted every undocumented person into an aggravated felon. And if you knew someone who was undocumented, including family, you would also face criminal charges. So there was a huge wave of what was a general strike, community-wide general strike. We were the third city in the country. And actually, I remember John coming to that in the first one. And I could see him in this like tens of thousands of people, because he was the tallest guy up there. So there's John in that mass of people. Remember John telling me, I come from a very small town. And of course, 2016 was a watershed in terms of the connection with farm workers and farmers, when, because of the use of the telephone and YouTube and all that, it really went viral. But there was at that point known as a state anti-sanctuary bill, but it very similar to that, that would have given police the ability to profile, and to actually anyone who was a public employee, the ability, if you thought someone could be undocumented, to actually communicate with ICE. And so it was something that, lawyers, teachers, doctors, all kinds of people came out against that, and obviously immigrant workers and their families themselves, and it was defeated. And so that was at the state capitol, and all kinds of industries. But with the farm workers, we had a mass of farm workers who came, and that brought attention to their employers, who then asked, in this case, the Dairy Business Association, like, hey, you're our political arm, what's going on? And it was, and then they ended up coming to that event, being a voice, lobbying, and that bill was defeated in 2016 under Governor Walker.
So you've seen a growing bipartisan awareness of the importance of immigration reform. Do you feel like that's something that could change, the sort of the sense that Republicans are against immigration reform?
I think what's really unfortunate, and we found this in the fight to restore driver's licenses to Wisconsin. We worked, by the way, very closely in 2000, and when was that, John? It would have been like 2000 and I believe it was 10 or 2009. We were one vote short of restoring that under Democrats, and then since then, it's really been vetoed out by Republicans in the state budget this last two times under Evers. And what we've heard is that there really, what we know is that there's a lot of support in the community for like restoring driver's licenses, for immigration reform. You hear that from local law enforcement, you hear that from people in the community. But the problem is that from my perspective, that what you're seeing is that even there's this quiet support among the legislature. Of course, you have people who are very dogmatic, you know, very anti-immigrant, but they're not having the confidence to really come forward and vote, and especially in these areas where you have big rural communities, they understand the need. This last time we were at the lobby day, one of the people we brought is a dairy worker from the Brown County area. And he was saying he was driving to work and he was getting stopped. And it just both because of cost and the risk of deportation, he had to quit that job. And we're in an economy where there's a labor shortage, and there has always been a labor shortage in the dairy industry. There you go. You have just, prevented someone who was a good worker from continuing in an industry. And if those industries go down, there will have this consequence. So I feel like we have to keep doing the grassroots work to eventually make a breakthrough, and it's going to take time. But I think kind of the dictates of the private prison industry through their lobbying arm has a big influence on the Republicans in the state legislature. And it's more their interest than the interest of the community where we're seeing things play out at the state capitol. In a lot of these anti-sanctuary bills, you had people speaking out. You had so many people coming out against them. And then you had the person of the bill, introducing the bill, like Nass, or, only being a voice and maybe one or two people. So it's disconnected from reality. It has to do with gerrymandering when there's not enough accountability. And it's just kind of this political calculation that people are making. And we have to prove them wrong, too. It's another area of organizing.
I think one thing that's really important to understand, and I want to go to John to talk a little bit more about why do we have so many immigrants working in dairy? There is no such thing as a year-round visa for low-skilled agricultural work in the United States. So it is not people's choice to be undocumented. It's their choice to work in an industry that's year-round. And it seems like it would be relatively easy to fix, to simply acknowledge an economic situation that's been going on for decades, that we rely so heavily on folks who are here, not just seasonally to follow crops and then go back, but year-round. And one of the big problems is we simply don't have that category of visa. So people who do technical jobs, who can get in through an educational program, there's some little loopholes where people can work legally, but the vast majority of people who are working on dairy farms in Wisconsin as immigrants are not here on a visa because there is no visa for them. But I wanted to go to you, John, to talk about why don't you hire people who live in the surrounding towns to work on your farm? Why are you hiring people who come from so far away from Mexico?
Well, about 25 years ago, the dairy industry is in a situation where everybody is in right now. You can go into every restaurant probably in the state, and the first thing you see is now hiring cooks and wait staff and kitchen help. And we were in that situation 25 years ago. And rather than closing down and not having enough people and working your tail off, we were working 96 hours a week, me, my wife, and my partners, to try to get everything done, and we weren't getting it done. And we try to hire, we do all the things that people tell you to do, is advertise and go. I would go into a farm supply store and offer the people working in the farm supply store, I'd go up to them and tell them that we'll pay you more to come and work for us, but they wouldn't do it. Nobody wants to work on a farm. They think it's the lowest job you could possibly have is to be a farm worker. And maybe that's our fault, but it's the reality of the situation. So we really had no choice. And I say reluctantly we turned to immigrants because we always want to do the things that are the easiest and the normal thing that you do. But I couldn't speak Spanish. I knew nothing about the culture. Hardly knew anybody that was Spanish, and or Mexican, and so it was not a normal thing for dairy farmers to do that. But once we had that experience and it got publicized a little bit, I would start getting calls, and I probably got 150 calls on this, of other farmers that were in the same situation. They couldn't hire anybody locally. Nobody wanted to work on a farm. And they said they didn't want to do it, but they want to hire immigrants. So we had a little one piece of paper that explained how to manage this situation. And I also had a person working for me named Roberto. It was Roberto Montalvo, not Roberto Tecbile, and from the same area, from Tepansacolco. And Roberto, I would go to Roberto because he worked nights and he was my go-to guy. And I would tell him about the phone call I had last night where somebody needed some help. And he would always say, well, I know somebody that would work there. And that person would be here in the afternoon. The farmer would come and pick him up and take him home. And about a month later, I'd get a call from the farmer. You could kind of hear that tears in his eyes and catch in his throat that solved the problem, that they now have wonderful people that they work with on the farm. And that's a unique thing with farmers. We're out there working shoulder to shoulder with all of our employees. And we're not just sitting in the office and pointing finger that go do this, go do that. And so it worked well. And but the big problem was the language. Didn't speak the language. It's really hard to communicate if you don't speak the same language. And the culture, we didn't know that either. And so we had to figure a way around that. And we did.
So I know part of the story is that your good friend, the local Spanish teacher in the town of Alma, was hired by Carl Dooley, the local ag extension agent, to travel around to farms and begin translating and helping farmers and farm workers from Mexico communicate with each other around the late 90s, early 2000s, when this really happened with the farm crisis and the collapse of smaller farms and the growth of the farms that were able to hang on, the need to hire employees, and then the immigrant labor force coming in. It was all very sudden. And so Sean Duval, that Spanish teacher, traveled around, translated on the farms, and then had this idea. She offered night classes in Spanish, right, for the farmers, and in English for the workers, and then had the idea of taking you all to Mexico to do a week-long Spanish immersion program that she had done. And that's what has turned into this nonprofit group that you now keep going, called Bridges Puentes, where farmers are going down every single year and visiting the towns where their workers come from. And I'd love to hear you describe a little bit kind of what that was like when you first went and how things have changed. And I know, it's very striking to hear you talk, because I know you've said, it's an agrarian society, and that sort of sense of common agrarian roots for Wisconsin dairy farmers and Mexican folks from smaller towns and rural areas of Mexico has been kind of formed a bond between you. So I'd love to hear you talk about the Bridges Puentes trips and sort of what struck you and what you saw when you went down there.
Well, when Sean approached that idea to us, I thought it was really stupid. Why would I have to spend some of my time going to Mexico to learn a language? I can do that here. I mean, it's just put it in your brain. I mean, it's not that hard, is it? Well, it's really, really hard. And I spent a lot of time, probably 80 hours in Mexico and lots of hours here trying to learn the language. And I still really suck at it. But I went on that first trip. There was 15 of us farmers. It was co-sponsored by the Babcock Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And most of us were farmers, I think all but a couple. And for most of us, it was the first time that we traveled to a country which would be called a disadvantaged country, let's say, compared to the United States. And we all had preconceived ideas about what we were going to see and what we were going to experience. But we went to the language school. We stayed in homes. We were not allowed to speak English, and some of us picked up a little bit, but we needed about 30 more trips to get a little bit better. But we had a couple days at the end where we had scheduled, I think, 10 days, and the classes were 8 days, and we had 2 days at the end. And somebody suggested that maybe what we should do in the last 2 days is go visit the families of our employees. And so we did that. and we traveled to Orizaba, which is a larger town. It's at the base of the mountains where Roberto comes from. Tepanzacualco and Atacinca and Talquipa, San Juan, Tehuacan are all the towns that our guys come from, and they're about 2 miles up a mountain, and they're really big mountains. And so we got to Orizaba. We stayed in a hotel right at the center of town, and right by the large cathedral and by the Zocalo, or the square, town square. And stayed overnight. The next morning, here Roberto Montalvo's family and another family came down, Umberto's family, came down to the hotel to meet us. And it was an incredible experience. And I guess it was an incredible experience for more than just me and the rest of the farmers, because the TV cameras were there, the newspapers were there, the radio stations were there. They told me later that this was the first time that they can remember where an employer came to Mexico to visit the families of their employees. And I thought that was absurd. I mean, why is this should happen all the time. How are you going to be a good employer if you don't know the culture, the language? How are you going to know this? You can't. So when we got back, and it looked like a one and done type of a thing, and I got together with Sean, and we exchanged emails every day for like 4 years. And we traveled all over the place trying to get support for the idea, but we kept it going. And it's going to this day, and we're going back the 30th of January of 2023. It'll be my 10th time down there.
Wow. I want to get back to Roberto, but I know Christine is going to have a hard stop because she has more things to do. So I want to ask you, Christine, to talk about sort of the state of policy on immigration, and what are the sort of long and short-term goals to improve the situation, to acknowledge these workers who are supporting our whole dairy industry, and to make things better for people? What are sort of the things that need to happen next, and what can people do to help?
I think on the encouraging side, last year, we were very, very closer than we've ever been to winning immigration reform through a pandemic relief package that was being voted on. It was one vote short in the Senate. That was part of the Build Back Better package. But so I think that is encouraging, the fact that there is a lot of support out there for immigration reform. But as we can tell, it's become, extremely polarized. And certainly, there's, I think, you have a very kind of a brand of like politics from like, that is running on this idea of like really white supremacy, that, let's, keep others down as opposed to like, let's bring each other up. And so I think that is something that is very serious, and it's an immediate threat to immigrant workers, their families, our communities, the economy, just the industry, because and I think that's that there are take for example Michael's running on a no driver's license, no in-state tuition, no immigration reform.
Michael's a Republican candidate for governor who's running against me.
Correct. And actually, I think we really have to like. I do believe that so on the one hand, I feel like opportunity and threat, and I don't want to limit that to like it's purely a political question, because I think it's also about making these personal connections between people. And I know Voces de la Frontera is planning to invest in a year-round organizer to really be able to, on a more continuous basis, especially around the state driver's license, is something restoring that. Wisconsin had that for decades, no big deal. And that's good for everybody, right? More money into the system, For the DMV, safer roads, people are tested, access to good insurance, people are not afraid of law enforcement. So, so I think ours is like, it really has to be a year-round, bottom-up, person-to-person, kind of what we've been doing, but we have kind of put the brakes on the state level, local level work to like sometimes shift to national work. We just recognize we just can't. So I think that struggle is going to take time. I think there are some immediate threats that programs like 287G, this anti-sanctuary bill that share information, legalize profiling, share information, have expanded. They expanded under Trump, and they've actually in some ways expanded through federal grants under Biden. So we have to I think the urgency to organize and have more of these connections is necessary. And so we believe we just have to escalate more at the local and state level. And the Latino community has a powerful voting capacity too, that there are 11,000 children of undocumented parents who are eligible to vote for the first time, U.S. citizens in 2018. That's half of the margin of victory. So there's a big voting block of pro-immigrant voting block. And it's important to show up as well, but we also need to show up in different spaces and in different ways.
And in terms of the transformation of rural Wisconsin because of immigration, we had a really interesting conversation about the town of Arcadia, where it's really become a largely Spanish-speaking town. And the most vibrant businesses on Main Street are Spanish-speaking owners. The school has become 75% Spanish-speaking students. It would have closed had it not had this immigrant community. So there is a transformation going on, and that's very interesting. And Roberto, I would love to ask you, what would make things better for you? What would you most like people to understand in Wisconsin and the United States that workers like yourself who are propping up the dairy industry need? What would be the best thing that could happen?
Yo pienso que tenemos que tener algo de oportunidades, porque solo no tener una licencia, pues no tenemos.
We need to have some kind of opportunities, because to not even be able to have a driver's license is terrible.
Y como estaba diciendo, por ejemplo, las aseguranzas que nos beneficia a nosotros y como a mucha gente también que casi nosotros no ocupamos mucho porque no andamos en las carreteras, pero las personas que trabajan en la construcción, los restaurantes tienen que mover del restaurante a su casa, pues tiene más difícil para moverse a ellos.
So focusing on the driver's licenses for farm workers, a lot of us aren't going out at all. We're really staying on the farms. We're not driving that much. But for people who work in construction or who work in restaurants and they have to go back and forth to work on the highway, it really isn't safe not to have driver's licenses.
Sí, es lo prioridad que un indocumentado, una persona latino que puede tener o tiene la oportunidad de tenerlo.
Really, undocumented people need the opportunity to have driver's licenses. And what else? What are your long-term goals? I had the privilege of going on one of Puente's trips and seeing your house. I saw your house in Mexico, which is beautiful. You've been building it for years and years, sending money home to build that house. Your whole family is involved. The town has been transformed with the infusion of money from people who are working up here on the farms, milking cows, improving the roads, building a school, building these houses. In the long term, have you decided if you want to live in the United States or you want to live in Mexico, or is it hard to say?
Sí, me encantaría vivir aquí. Todo ser humano pues necesita la oportunidad donde quiera que esté o donde quiera, en cualquier país puede ir.
I would really love to live here. I love living here, but every human being needs the opportunity to live somewhere and to be secure.
Y para vivir, pues me gustaría si tuviera algún un trabajo o algo que puedo ayudar a las personas, que
I'd like to have a job where I can really help people.
y lo necesitan porque ellos no tienen esa oportunidad que nosotros tenemos. Entonces, estoy bien.
And to helping people in Mexico who don't have that kind of opportunity that I have here is really important to me.
Si, por ejemplo, una escuela estuviera con más maestros de diferentes, o un país que, por ejemplo, los maestros que salen aquí se van a otro país, me encantaría que estuviera uno en mi pueblo.
I love it that the teachers who graduate here and get to go to other countries, and I would love to have that kind of opportunity too. So John, tell us about the golf. You and Roberto are golfing buddies. You've gotten involved in playing that game together over the years, and you're playing this afternoon.
Well, Roberto told me a few years ago that he worked at Myrtle Beach on a golf course. So I kind of put two and two together and see if he would play with me. So he did, and he wasn't that good at first. And I told him that, well, if you ever beat me, I think I'm just going to quit, because he wasn't very good. Well, last Monday, we played in Mondovi, and there's four of us, and he had the best score of the four of us. But I'm not going to quit. I got another chance at him today again. So, but he can hit it a mile, and he's about half my size. And we play every Monday from the time the snow goes away to the time the snow comes. He plays league golf, and he subs for league golf. He's a member of the golf course. We go to the golf course, and we usually go together because save gas. And we get there, and we get out of the car and stuff, and we start walking to the golf course. There's other people there, and they're all saying, "Hi, Roberto, hi, Roberto." But nobody says, "Hi, John, hi, John." So it's been a great time. And we usually play for money. Last time we played for a golf ball, and he won. No, we lost last time, didn't we? Yeah. And so today maybe we'll win it back. But
That's great.
It's what we do for fun.
And just as a last question, because we're almost out of time, you know, talking about the transformation of rural Wisconsin, your family were immigrants, John, and you have an interesting kind of long view of sort of the next wave of immigrants coming into dairy farming and thinking about whether really it could be a Mexican future for rural Wisconsin. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your plans might be in terms of your employees sticking around for the long haul?
Well, you try to learn from history, and history around here anyway is that immigrants came to work the farms. They came from Germany, Switzerland, Norway, and every other place in the world, but mainly Northern European. And they started farming around here, and they each had a farm, and they had a family, and then they became a part of the community. They had, like where I went to church, it was all immigrants that started that. German services until World War I. During World War I, it wasn't very popular to be German anymore, so then they switched to English. My great-grandfather, Senti, they called him Switzer Juckli. He wrote a little article for the paper in Swiss or German. He refused to learn English. He just absolutely refused. So everybody had to learn or speak German to him in order to communicate with him. And it wasn't maybe because he couldn't learn, but he didn't want to. So now in Buffalo County, which isn't a very big county, we used to have like 800 dairy farms. We're down to 80 now, maybe 85. And on 27 of those farms, the work is being done by immigrants, and mainly Mexicans, and mainly from the Veracruz, state of Veracruz, and mainly from the villages where Roberto comes from. So it just makes sense that the new wave would be the people that want to farm, that want to live on farms and work on farms and find the work honorable, are going to be the people that would be our successors. And I hope in my lifetime that I'm able to help that along a little bit. And so I would really, really like it if when I'm being carted off to the the place I'm going to die or something like that, that I can be comfortable in knowing that the farm is being run by my employees, my immigrant employees. That would be, and that is my goal.
Such a great vision. Well, thank you so much, you guys. It was wonderful to talk with you. I think we're just about out of time. And I don't want to keep you because I know you need to go practice your swings.
One last thing, Ruth.
Yeah.
Roberto and I were wondering if when we were talking, we should have done this. So.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. Yep. Good to promote the book.
Yep, gotta do it.
You can read a lot more about John and Roberto and Christine and the other people who are really wonderful people who are transforming the dairy industry and the face of Wisconsin. So I hope you'll pick it up. Thanks a lot.